Winter, 208 AD. The Yangtze River, China's great arterial waterway, lay shrouded in the cold mist of December. Along its southern banks, an army of exhausted men watched the northern horizon with growing dread. They knew what was coming. Cao Cao, the most powerful warlord in China, was marching south with a force so massive that historical records would struggle to agree on its actual size. Some claimed 800,000 men. Modern historians suggest closer to 230,000. Either way, it was an army large enough to darken the roads for miles, to consume entire provinces' worth of grain, to make the earth itself tremble under the weight of so many boots and hooves. Against this juggernaut stood an alliance born of desperation. Two southern warlords, Quan and Liu Bei, had joined forces not out of friendship but out of necessity. Together they could field perhaps 50,000 men, trained marines and soldiers pulled from the southeastern territories. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Cao Cao had them outnumbered at least 4-1, possibly as much as 16-1. In any conventional battle, the Southern Alliance would be annihilated. But this would not be a conventional battle. What unfolded over those winter months along the Yangtze would become one of the most famous military engagements in Chinese history. The Battle of Red Cliffs would end Cao Cao's dream of reunifying China under his banner. It would establish the defensive frontiers that would give birth to the Three Kingdoms period, and it would be remembered for centuries not for the clash of armies on open ground, but for fire, for deception, for the moment when ships became weapons and the river itself became a battlefield. To understand how this battle came to be, you have to understand the world it emerged from. The Han Dynasty, which had ruled China for nearly 4 centuries, was dying. Not the quick death of conquest or assassination, but the slow death of institutional decay. By the late 2nd century AD, the emperor was a figurehead. Real power lay with regional governors and military commanders who had been granted extraordinary authority to deal with rebellions and invasions. What had been intended as a temporary emergency measure became permanent. These regional strongmen became warlords, carving out their own territories, building their own armies, ignoring directives from the capital. Cao Cao was perhaps the most successful of these warlords. Born around 155 AD into a family with court connections, he had risen through a combination of military brilliance, political cunning, and ruthless pragmatism. By 208 AD he controlled all of northern China. He held the emperor at his court, giving his actions a veneer of legitimacy. When Cao Cao issued orders, he did so in the emperor's name. When he marched to war, he claimed to be suppressing rebels and restoring imperial authority. Everyone understood the reality. The emperor was a puppet. Cao Cao was the true power in the north. In the south, the situation was more fragmented. Sun Quan controlled the southeastern territories around the Yangtze Delta, a wealthy region enriched by trade and agriculture. His family had been building power there for decades. His father, Sun Jian, and his older brother Sun Si had both been formidable military leaders. Sun Quan, still in his 20s in 208 AD, had inherited their domain and their veterans. Further west, Liu Bei represented a very different kind of power. He claimed descent from the imperial family, giving him a sort of legitimacy that Cao Cao could never quite achieve. But Liu Bei's actual holdings were modest. He was a warlord without a stable base, dependent on alliances and constantly moving to stay ahead of his enemies. The crisis that would lead to Red Cliffs began in the summer of 208 AD. The governor of Jing province, a vast territory in central China that controlled key portions of the Yangtze, had recently died. His son surrendered the province to Cao Cao almost without a fight, giving the northern warlord control of an enormous fleet of ships and a strategic position along the river. This was an existential threat to both Sun Quan and Liu Bei. From Jing province, Cao Cao could strike south into Sun Quan's heartland. He could move his armies by water, bypassing the defensive terrain that had protected the south. Liu Bei, who had been operating in Jing province, was forced into a hasty retreat. At the Battle of Changban, Cao Cao's cavalry caught up with his forces and the refugees travelling with them. Liu Bei's army was scattered. He escaped with his key generals, including the legendary Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, but he had lost most of his military strength. He fled downriver to Xiaku, where he linked up with Sun Quan's emissary, a diplomat named Lu Su. This is where the alliance was forged. Liu Bei sent his chief advisor, Zhuge Liang, to negotiate with Sun Quan. The meeting was tense. Many of Sun Quan's advisors urged surrender. Zhang Zhao, Sun Quan's chief clerk, argued that resisting Cao Cao was futile. The disparity in forces was too great. Better to submit, preserve their territories, and hope for favourable terms. But Zhuge Liang made a different argument. He said that Cao Cao's army, for all its size, was vulnerable. The northern soldiers were exhausted from their long campaign. They were suffering from disease. They were not trained for naval warfare. Most critically, many of them were recently surrendered troops whose loyalty to Cao Cao was questionable. Sun Quan's chief military commander, Zhou Yu, supported Zhuge Liang's assessment. Zhou Yu was a brilliant strategist in his own right, a man who understood naval warfare intimately. He estimated Cao Cao's true strength at around 230,000 men. Substantial, but not invincible. Sun Quan made his decision during an assembly of his advisors. According to historical accounts, he chopped off a corner of his desk with his sword and declared that anyone who continued to argue for surrender would be treated the same way. The message was clear. They would fight. Sun Quan committed 30,000 marines and ships to the alliance, placing them under Zhou Yu's command. Combined with Liu Bei's remaining forces, perhaps 20,000 men, the Allied army was still heavily outnumbered. But numbers would not decide this battle. Position would, tactics would, and fire would. The Allied fleet sailed upstream from their positions near modern-day Anjou, moving toward Red Cliffs, a location whose exact position historians still debate, but which lay somewhere along the middle reaches of the Yangtze. They encountered Cao Cao's vanguard forces in a series of skirmishes that revealed the northern army's weaknesses immediately. Cao Cao's men were indeed suffering. Disease, possibly dysentery or some form of epidemic illness, was ravaging the ranks. The forced marches of the southern campaign had left them exhausted, and the northerners, men from the dry plains and valleys of northern China, were profoundly uncomfortable on water. Seasickness was endemic. Morale was low. After the initial skirmishing, both sides pulled back to establish positions. Cao Cao withdrew his forces to the northern bank of the Yangtze at a place called Wulin, across the river from Red Cliffs. The Allies took up positions on the southern bank. The two armies watched each other across the water, preparing for the decisive engagement. It was Zhou Yu who first noticed Cao Cao's critical mistake. To combat the seasickness afflicting his troops, Cao Cao had ordered his ships chained together, stem to stern. The idea was sound in theory. By lashing the vessels together, you created a more stable platform. Individual ships would rock less in the current and wind. Soldiers could move between vessels more easily. For an army unaccustomed to naval warfare, it made the ships feel more like solid ground. But Zhou Yu saw the fatal flaw. Chained together, Cao Cao's fleet had sacrificed mobility for stability. The ships could not maneuver independently. They could not scatter. They formed one massive immobile target, and immobile targets, Zhou Yu knew, were vulnerable to fire. The strategy that emerged was deceptively simple in concept, but required perfect execution and extraordinary courage. The Allies would send fireships into Cao Cao's fleet. These vessels, loaded with combustible materials, would be set ablaze and directed into the chained northern ships. The fire would spread from vessel to vessel, the chains themselves becoming conduits for the flames. Cao Cao's army, trapped on burning ships, would be destroyed not by the sword but by fire and water. The challenge was getting the fireships close enough. Cao Cao was no fool. He would be watching for any suspicious approach. His archers would fire on any hostile vessels that came within range. The fireships would need a pretext, a reason to be approaching that would not immediately trigger alarm. This is where one of the Allied commanders, a veteran general named Huang Gai, proposed a plan as bold as it was dangerous. Huang Gai would send a letter to Cao Cao, claiming he wished to defect. The letter would explain that Huang Gai was unhappy with the alliance, that he believed resistance was futile, and that he was prepared to bring his ships over to Cao Cao's side. When Cao Cao's messenger returned, the northern warlord expressed some skepticism, saying he feared it might be a trick. But he also said that if Huang Gai's offer was genuine, he would reward him handsomely. The seed of the deception had been planted. Huang Gai prepared approximately 10 ships for the attack, though historical sources disagree on the exact number. These vessels were described as Mengchong and Dujian, types of warships that could carry significant cargo. They were filled with kindling, dry reeds, and fatty oil, materials that would burn hot and fast. Behind these larger vessels, Huang Gai arranged smaller boats, escape craft that would allow his skeleton crews to flee once the fires were set. The date of the attack was set for a time when the wind would be favourable. This detail, the southeastern wind, would become central to the later romanticised versions of the story. In the novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written over 1,000 years after the actual events, the strategist Zhuge Liang is portrayed as summoning this wind through a Taoist ritual, commanding the elements themselves to aid the Southern Alliance. The historical reality was probably more mundane. Zhou Yu and his commanders, as experienced mariners, understood the seasonal weather patterns of the Yangtze. They knew when winds from the southeast were most likely. They waited for the right conditions. When the day arrived, Huang Gai's squadron began its approach. As the ships sailed toward the middle of the river, they raised their sails and displayed signals indicating surrender. Huang Gai himself lifted a torch and ordered his men to shout declarations of defection. Cao Cao's troops came out of their camps to watch. The historical account states they could be heard saying that Huang Gai was coming to join them. The deception was working. When Huang Gai's ships were approximately 2 li away from Cao Cao's fleet, roughly 20 li being about 8 miles, the order was given. The fires were lit. As flames engulfed the ships, Huang Gai's men scrambled into the smaller boats they had positioned behind the fire ships. The skeleton crews rowed frantically away as the burning vessels, carried by the strong southeastern wind, surged forward like flaming arrows. What happened next was described in stark terms by the contemporary historian Chen Shu. The fire was fierce and the wind was strong and the ships went like arrows. The whole northern fleet was burnt and the fire reached the camps on the bank. In a very short time, the smoke and flame stretched across the sky, and a multitude of men and horses were burned or drowned and died. The chained ships meant to provide stability became a death trap. As one vessel caught fire, the flames spread along the chains to the next, and the next. Men dove into the water to escape the heat, only to drown in the current or be pulled under by their armour and equipment. Those who stayed on the ships were consumed by fire. The flames jumped from the fleet to Cao Cao's camps on the northern shore, turning the land positions into an extension of the inferno. Zhou Yu had been waiting for exactly this moment. As Cao Cao's forces descended into chaos, the Allied commanders led a combined naval and land assault. Light-armed forces moved quickly, exploiting the confusion. Cao Cao's army, already weakened by disease, demoralized by the southern campaign, and now shocked by the fire attack, could not mount an effective defence. The battle was not a prolonged engagement but a rout. Cao Cao, recognising that the situation was hopeless, ordered a general retreat. But the disaster for Cao Cao's army was only beginning. The retreat north would prove even more deadly than the battle itself. The route they had to take was called Warong Road, a path that led through marshlands north of Dongting Lake. Recent heavy rains had turned this already difficult terrain into a nightmare. The road became a thick mire of mud that sucked at the feet of marching men and mired the hooves of horses. The sick soldiers, and by this point many of Cao Cao's men were sick, had to carry bundles of grass on their backs. They would throw these bundles into the mud to create temporary surfaces for the cavalry and officers to cross. Many of these men, weakened by disease and exhaustion, simply fell into the mud and drowned. Others were trampled to death by the horses and mounted soldiers passing over the makeshift grass paths. The Allied forces pursued relentlessly, harrying the retreating northern army at every opportunity. The combination of combat casualties, disease, drowning, and starvation during the retreat decimated Cao Cao's forces. The historical sources are clear that more men died during the retreat along Huarong Road than in the actual battle at Red Cliffs. Cao Cao eventually made it back to his northern territories, but he had lost a substantial portion of his army, and more critically, he had lost the momentum of his southern campaign. He would never again have such an opportunity to reunite China under his control. The aftermath of Red Cliffs reshaped the political landscape of China. Cao Cao, despite his defeat, remained powerful in the north. He controlled the emperor and the governmental apparatus, but he was forced to accept that he could not conquer the south. The Yangtze River, which he had hoped to use as a highway for his armies, instead became the frontier that separated his domain from his rivals. In 216 AD, Cao Cao accepted the title King of Wei, effectively acknowledging that he ruled a kingdom rather than serving as a minister of a united empire. Liu Bei used the breathing space provided by the victory to consolidate his position. He gained control of 4 commanderies in southern Jing province, finally giving him a stable territorial base. From this foundation, he he would eventually establish the kingdom of Shuhan in the west. Sun Quan strengthened his control of the southeast, establishing what would become the kingdom of Eastern Wu. When Cao Cao died in 220 AD, his son Cao Pi would force the Han emperor to abdicate, formally ending the Han dynasty and establishing the kingdom of Cao Wei. Liu Bei and Sun Quan would both proclaim themselves emperors of their own kingdoms in response. China was divided into three kingdoms: Wei in the north, Shuhan in the west, and Wu in the southeast. This period, from 220 to 280 AD, would be known as the Three Kingdoms period, an era of near-constant warfare as each kingdom claimed the right to rule all of China but lacked the strength to subdue the others. The Battle of Red Cliffs had made this division possible. It had prevented Cao Cao from achieving quick reunification, and had given his rivals the time and territory they needed to establish themselves as legitimate powers. But even as we tell this story based on the historical records, we need to acknowledge how much the Battle of Red Cliffs has been shaped by legend and literary embellishment. The most significant source of this romanticization is the novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written by Luo Guanzhong in the 14th century, over 1,000 years after the actual events. This novel, which blends historical facts with fiction, folklore, and dramatic invention, has profoundly influenced how Chinese culture remembers the Three Kingdoms period. In the novel, the character of Zhuge Liang is elevated to near superhuman status. He's portrayed as a genius strategist who orchestrates nearly every aspect of the southern victory. The novel includes famous episodes that have no basis in historical record. In one story, Zhou Yu assigned Zhuge Liang the seemingly impossible task of producing 100,000 arrows in 10 days, intending for him to fail and be executed. Zhuge Liang instead accomplishes the task in 3 days by sailing boats covered in straw toward Cao Cao's fleet under cover of fog. Cao Cao's archers, unable to see clearly, fire thousands of arrows at what they believe are enemy ships. The arrows stick in the straw, and Zhuge Liang returns with more arrows than required. This story is almost certainly fictional, though something similar may have happened in a different battle several years later. There is a historical account of Sun Quan using boats to collect arrows during a different engagement with Cao Cao in 213 AD at a place called Ruxu. The romance took this incident and attributed it to Zhuge Liang at Red Cliffs, enhancing his reputation as a strategic genius. Similarly, the novel portrays Zhuge Liang as summoning the southeastern wind through a Taoist ritual, performed on an altar. In the story, as the planned date of attack approaches, the wind is blowing in the wrong direction. Any fireship attack would fail, or worse, set the allied fleet ablaze instead. Zhou Yu realizes this problem and falls into despair. Zhuge Liang then claims he can change the wind through supernatural means. He builds an altar and performs elaborate rituals for 3 days. On the 3rd day, the wind shifts to the southeast, allowing the fire attack to proceed. The novel presents this as evidence of Zhuge Liang's connection to cosmic forces and his command over nature itself. The historical reality is that Zhou Yu, as an experienced naval commander, would have known about seasonal wind patterns and would have planned the attack for a time when favourable winds were likely. The romanticized version gives credit to Zhuge Liang's supernatural powers, while the actual credit probably belongs to Zhou Yu's understanding of the Yangtze's weather. In fact, the historical sources suggest that Zhuge Liang's role in the actual battle was relatively minor. His most significant contribution was diplomatic. He successfully negotiated the alliance between Liu Bei and Sun Quan, convincing Sun Quan to fight rather than surrender. But once the alliance was formed and the military operations began, the command fell to Zhou Yu. It was Zhou Yu who observed the vulnerability created by Cao Cao's chained ships. It was Zhou Yu who approved Huang Gai's fireship strategy. It was Zhou Yu who commanded the follow-up assault after the fire attack. The historical records make clear that Zhou Yu was the architect of the victory. Yet in popular memory, shaped by centuries of storytelling, opera performances, and more recently films and video games, Zhuge Liang has become the central figure of Red Cliffs. This is partly because Liu Bei's kingdom of Shuhan claimed to be the legitimate heir to the Han dynasty, and later dynasties often viewed the Shuhan cause sympathetically. Elevating Zhuge Liang, Liu Bei's strategist, served political and cultural purposes. It made the story more dramatically satisfying to have a singular genius masterminding the victory. The novel also invented a subplot often called the self-torture ruse, or battered body stratagem. In this fictional account, Huang Gai and Zhou Yu stage an elaborate deception to convince Cao Cao that Huang Gai's defection is genuine. They have a public confrontation where Huang Gai insults Zhou Yu. Zhou Yu orders Huang Gai executed, but other officers plead for mercy. Instead of execution, Huang Gai is severely flogged, receiving a brutal beating that leaves him badly wounded. This beating, witnessed by Cao Cao's spies embedded in the Allied camp, convinces Cao Cao that the defection is real. A man who has been so publicly humiliated and physically punished by his own commander would surely want revenge. This story has no basis in the historical records. What we know is that Huang Gai sent a letter to Cao Cao claiming he wanted to defect, and Cao Cao, while somewhat suspicious, was willing to believe it was possible. The self-torture ruse is a dramatic invention that makes the story more exciting but obscures the simpler reality that Cao Cao, confident in his numerical superiority, was susceptible to believing that some of his outnumbered opponents might choose to switch sides. Another major invention in the novel concerns the retreat along Huarong Road. The romance includes a story where Liu Bei's sworn brother Guan Yu is assigned to intercept Cao Cao during his retreat. Guan Yu sets up an ambush at a narrow point along the road. When Cao Cao arrives, exhausted and nearly defeated, he finds Guan Yu blocking his path. But years earlier, Cao Cao had shown Guan Yu kindness when Guan Yu was briefly in Cao Cao's custody. Guan Yu, bound by a sense of honour and obligation for that past favour, allows Cao Cao to pass through the ambush unharmed. This act of mercy lets Cao Cao escape when he should have been captured or killed. This story has become one of the most famous episodes in Chinese literature, exploring themes of honour, duty, and the conflict between personal obligation and strategic necessity. But it is fiction. There is no historical evidence that Guan Yu was positioned at Huarong Road, or that he allowed Cao Cao to escape. The historical Cao Cao escaped because his army, though battered, was still large enough to fight off pursuit, and because the Allied forces, much smaller in number, could not risk a full-scale engagement that might allow Cao Cao to rally and counterattack. The reason these fictional elements matter is that they have become, in many ways, more culturally significant than the historical facts. When modern Chinese people think of the Battle of Red Cliffs, many are thinking of the novel's version, not the historical record. The battle has been adapted into films, most notably director John Woo's 2008 epic Red Cliff, which was one of the highest-grossing domestic films in Chinese history. It has been featured in countless video games, television series, and operas. In all of these adaptations, the fictional elements often take precedence because they make for better drama. But if we strip away the embellishments and focus on what the historical sources tell us, the Battle of Red Cliffs remains an extraordinary military achievement. A numerically inferior force used superior naval expertise, knowledge of the terrain and weather, psychological warfare through the feigned defection, and innovative tactics with fireships to defeat an army that should have been unstoppable. The victory was not the result of one genius strategist, but of multiple commanders, Zhou Yu primarily, but also Huang Gai and others, who understood their advantages and exploited their enemies' weaknesses. The battle also reveals something about the nature of warfare in this period of Chinese history. Large armies were not necessarily effective armies. Cao Cao's forces were massive, but they were a mixed force of different origins. Many were recently conscripted or surrendered troops whose loyalty was questionable. They were suffering from disease, a constant problem in pre-modern military campaigns that often killed more soldiers than combat did. They were operating in an environment, naval warfare on a major river, that they were not trained for. And they were led by a commander who, despite his many talents, made critical tactical errors like chaining his ships together. The Southern Alliance, by contrast, had smaller numbers but higher quality forces. Sun Quan's Marines were professionals trained for river combat. They knew the Yangtze intimately. They could maneuver their smaller, more agile vessels in ways that Cao Cao's northern troops could not match. They fought on terrain that favoured their expertise, and they had commanders who understood that in their strategic position they could not win a conventional battle, so they had to fight unconventionally. The use of fire as a weapon was not new in Chinese warfare, but the scale of the fireship attack at Red Cliffs was unprecedented. This was not a few burning vessels, but a coordinated assault using multiple ships as delivery systems for what was essentially a large-scale incendiary weapon. The combination of the fireships, the favourable wind, the chained enemy fleet, and the follow-up assault by Allied forces made it devastatingly effective. The psychological impact of the fire attack cannot be understated. men trapped on burning ships surrounded by water, watching flames spread from vessel to vessel, while comrades drown or burn to death. This is a level of terror that would break even well-trained troops. Cao Cao's army, already demoralized and sick, stood no chance of maintaining cohesion under such an assault. The rapid collapse of northern resistance made sense not because the soldiers were cowards, but because the situation was genuinely hopeless. Fire on water, with no escape, is a nightmare scenario for any military force. The battle's long-term consequences extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. The Three Kingdoms period that emerged after Red Cliffs would last for 60 years, from 220 to 280 AD. During this time, China experienced near-constant warfare, shifting alliances and competition between three rival courts, each claiming to be the legitimate government of China. The period produced some of the most famous military campaigns, strategic innovations, and legendary figures in Chinese history. Eventually, the Three Kingdoms would be reunified, but not by any of the three original kingdoms. The state of Chao Wei would be usurped by one of its own generals' families, the Sima clan, who would establish the Jin dynasty. The Jin would then conquer Shu Han in 263 AD and Eastern Wu in 280 AD, bringing the Three Kingdoms period to an end and reuniting China under a single government. But that reunification took 72 years, from the Battle of Red Cliffs, and the entire trajectory of those decades was shaped by the outcome at Red Cliffs. By preventing Cao Cao from conquering the south in 208 AD, the battle ensured that China would remain divided for generations. The Battle of Red Cliffs also had cultural and intellectual consequences. The Three Kingdoms period, with its complex politics, larger-than-life personalities, and dramatic military conflicts, became one of the richest sources of stories in Chinese culture. The period inspired histories, novels, plays, operas, and eventually films and games. The characters and events of the Three Kingdoms became moral examples, used to teach lessons about loyalty, strategy, honor, and leadership. Zhuge Liang became the archetype of the brilliant strategist. Guan Yu became deified as a god of war and loyalty. Cao Cao became the example of the cunning, ruthless politician. These archetypes, emerging from this historical period and shaped by the battle at Red Cliffs, have influenced Chinese culture for nearly 2 millennia. For military historians, Red Cliffs offers lessons that remain relevant. The importance of logistics and supply lines, the danger of overextension, the value of fighting on terrain that favours your forces, the effectiveness of unconventional tactics against numerically superior opponents. These are principles demonstrated at Red Cliffs that apply across different eras and contexts. The battle also shows the importance of intelligence and deception in warfare. Huang Gai's false defection, a relatively simple ruse, was crucial to getting the fireships into position. Without that deception, Cao Cao's forces would have been alert and might have been able to counter the fireship attack before it became catastrophic. The role of environmental factors, specifically the wind and the river current, was also critical. Modern military planners often talk about the importance of understanding and using the operational environment. At Red Cliffs, the southern commanders demonstrated this principle perfectly. They understood the seasonal wind patterns, the current of the Yangtze, the effects of chaining ships together in moving water. They built their entire strategy around environmental factors that their opponents either did not understand or could not adapt to in time. There is also a lesson about the limitations of numerical superiority. Cao Cao had overwhelming numbers, but those numbers did not translate into overwhelming combat power. His troops were sick, tired, demoralized, and operating in an environment where their training and experience did not apply. The Southern Alliance had fewer men but higher quality troops fighting under favorable conditions. Quality, training, morale, and tactical situation mattered more than raw numbers. This is a lesson that has been demonstrated repeatedly throughout military history, but remains sometimes ignored by commanders who believe that simply having more soldiers guarantees victory. The disaster along Hurong Road during the retreat also illustrates the often overlooked fact that retreats can be more deadly than battles. Many military campaigns in history have seen the pursuing force inflict more casualties during the enemy's retreat than during the actual combat. At Red Cliffs, the combination of disease, difficult terrain, lack of supplies, and constant pursuit by Allied forces turned Cao Cao's retreat into a catastrophe that possibly exceeded the casualties of the fire attack itself. the importance of maintaining unit cohesion and morale during a retreat, of having planned withdrawal routes, of protecting the rear guard, all of these factors that Cao Cao's army seems to have failed at, are critical elements of military operations that Red Cliffs illustrates. As we approach the end of this story, it is worth reflecting on why the Battle of Red Cliffs has maintained such a powerful hold on Chinese imagination for nearly 2,000 years. Partly it's because of the dramatic nature of the battle itself. Fireships, deception, a massive fleet consumed by flames, a disastrous retreat through mud and rain. These are inherently dramatic images. Partly it is because of what the battle represented, the moment when the dream of quick reunification died, when it became clear that China would remain divided, setting the stage for decades of conflict and competition. But perhaps most significantly, Red Cliffs has endured in memory because it represented a victory of strategy over strength, of intelligence over brute force, of the underdog overcoming overwhelming odds. These are themes that resonate across cultures and eras. The image of two smaller kingdoms joining forces to defeat the mighty northern warlord, of clever tactics and brave men achieving what should have been impossible. This is the kind of story that people want to tell and retell. It does not matter that the historical reality was probably less dramatic than the legends suggest. It does not matter that many of the most famous episodes were literary inventions. What matters is that the core story of the improbable victory on the Yangtze in the winter of 208 AD is true. On a cold December day or early January night, depending on the exact date that historians still debate, the river burned. Cao Cao's massive fleet, chained together for stability, became a funeral pyre for thousands of men. The flames lit up the winter sky, visible for miles, painting the mist and clouds with orange and red. Men screamed as they burned or drowned. Ships groaned and collapsed as fire consumed their timbers. On the southern bank, the Allied forces watched the destruction they had unleashed, knowing that they had achieved something extraordinary. They had stopped what seemed unstoppable. They had saved their kingdoms from conquest, and they had changed the course of Chinese history. The Battle of Red Cliffs was not the longest battle, not the bloodiest, not fought with the most advanced weapons or the largest armies in human history. But it was a turning point, one of those moments when the direction of events shifts, when what seemed inevitable becomes impossible, and when new possibilities emerge. Without Red Cliffs, there would have been no Three Kingdoms period, no 60 years of divided China, no rich tradition of stories and legends drawn from that era. Cao Cao would have conquered the south, Liu Bei and Quan would have been defeated or killed, and China would have been reunified under northern control decades earlier than it actually was. Instead, the fireships did their work. The flames spread. The northern fleet burned, and three kingdoms rose from the ashes to compete for the mandate of heaven. That competition, that division, that era of heroes and strategists and endless warfare, all began with one decisive battle on the Yangtze River in the winter of 208 AD, when fire on water determined the fate of an empire. The decades that followed the Battle of Red Cliffs witnessed a complex dance of warfare, diplomacy, and internal consolidation, as the three kingdoms sought to establish their legitimacy and expand their territories. The period from 208 to 280 AD became one of the most militarily active eras in Chinese history, with each kingdom developing distinct strategic approaches based on their geographical positions and resource bases. Xiao Wei, the northern kingdom that emerged after Cao Cao's death in 220 AD, remained the most powerful of the three states throughout most of the period. Occupying the Yellow River Valley and the North China Plain, Wei controlled approximately two-thirds of China's population and the most productive agricultural lands. The kingdom's capital at Luoyang, the former Han Dynasty capital, provided symbolic legitimacy. Cao Cao's son, Cao Pi, who formally established the Wei dynasty by forcing the last Han emperor to abdicate, understood that while his father's defeat at Red Cliffs had been a setback, the fundamental advantages of the north remained intact. Wei's military strategy focused on consolidation and defense. The northern borders required constant attention due to threats from nomadic peoples beyond the frontier. The Xiongnu, Xianbei, and other groups posed persistent challenges that demanded military resources. Wei also had to maintain pressure on both southern rivals simultaneously, preventing them from combining their forces as they had done at Red Cliffs. This meant maintaining two separate military fronts, one facing west toward Shuhan and another facing southeast toward Wu. The relationship between Wei and its two rivals was not consistently hostile. There were periods of active warfare, periods of tense peace, and even occasional diplomatic cooperation when it served mutual interests. The three kingdoms engaged in a sophisticated game of alliance and betrayal that would have been familiar to any student of balance of power politics. When one kingdom seemed to be gaining too much strength, the other two might cooperate to contain it. When opportunities arose to gain territory or weaken a rival, alliances could be abandoned quickly. Shu Han, established by Liu Bei in 221 AD with its capital at Chengdu in the Sichuan Basin, faced the most difficult strategic position of the three kingdoms. Sichuan was naturally defensible, protected by mountains and difficult terrain that made invasion challenging. But this same geography that provided security also limited Shu Han's ability to project power outward. The kingdom was relatively isolated, and its population and resource base were the smallest of the three states. Liu Bei's legitimacy claim rested on his purported descent from the Han imperial family. He styled himself as the rightful heir to the Han dynasty, positioning Shu Han as the continuation of legitimate Chinese rule. This claim had propaganda value but did not translate into military or economic advantage. What Shu Han did have was Zhuge Liang, who served as chancellor and chief strategist after Liu Bei's death in 223 AD. Zhuge Liang's actual achievements as an administrator and military commander, as opposed to his legendary reputation, reveal a complex figure. He proved to be an effective administrator, implementing land reforms and establishing a merit-based bureaucracy in Shu Han. He maintained internal stability in a kingdom that could have easily fragmented after Liu Bei's death. He also proved capable of organizing and supplying military campaigns, a logistical challenge in the mountainous terrain that separated Shu Han from its enemies. Between 228 and 234 AD, Zhuge Liang launched 5 major military campaigns against Wei, attempting to expand northward and eventually conquer the Central Plains. These campaigns, known as the Northern Expeditions, demonstrated both Zhuge Liang's capabilities and the fundamental limitations Shu Han faced. The expeditions required moving large armies through difficult mountain passes, particularly the Qinling Mountains that separated Sichuan from the Wei River Valley and the approaches to the Wei capital. Supply lines for these campaigns were extraordinarily long and vulnerable. Zhuge Liang developed innovative logistics systems, including the wooden ox and gliding horse, which historical sources describe as types of wheelbarrows or carts designed to transport supplies efficiently over mountain roads. Whether these were genuinely innovative designs or simply effective applications of existing technology remains debated, but they illustrate the practical challenges Shu Han faced in offensive operations. The northern expeditions achieved some tactical successes. Zhuge Liang demonstrated skill in siege warfare and in choosing defensive positions that negated Wei's numerical advantages. In several engagements, he successfully repelled Wei counterattacks and held captured territory for extended periods. But he could never achieve the decisive breakthrough that would have allowed Shu Han to permanently expand its territory or seriously threaten Wei's heartland. The primary obstacle was not Zhuge Liang's tactical or strategic abilities, but the structural imbalance between the kingdoms. Wei simply had more resources, more men, and could absorb losses that would be catastrophic for Shu Han. Wei's generals, particularly Sima Yi, who emerged as the main opponent facing Zhuge Liang, adopted a defensive strategy that exploited these advantages. Rather than seeking decisive battles, Sima Yi would fortify positions, avoid major engagements, and wait for Shu Han's supply difficulties to force withdrawals. Zhuge Liang died in 234 AD during the 5th Northern Expedition, while encamped near the Wei River. He was only 54 years old. His death reportedly occurred after a period of overwork and stress, suggesting that the sustained effort of organizing and leading these campaigns had taken a physical toll. The Shu Han army withdrew in good order, reportedly so disciplined that Wei forces did not realize their opponent's commander had died until after the retreat was complete. This gave rise to a Chinese saying, "A dead Zhuge Liang frightens away a living Sima Yi." After Zhuge Liang's death, Shu Han never again posed a serious offensive threat to Wei. The kingdom continued to exist, but its military campaigns became smaller in scale and more defensive in nature. Without Zhuge Liang's administrative skills and strategic vision, Shu Han gradually weakened. Internal political conflicts emerged, particularly involving the eunuch Huang Hao, who gained influence over the later Emperor Liu Shan, Liu Bei's son. The kingdom's military and political institutions deteriorated over the following decades. Eastern Wu, Sun Quan's kingdom in the southeast, pursued a very different strategic approach. Wu controlled the Yangtze River Delta and the coastal regions of southeastern China, areas that were wealthy but less populous than the north. The kingdom's strength lay in its naval power and its ability to defend river lines and coastal areas. Sun Quan, who ruled for a remarkably long period from 222 until his death in 252 AD at age 71, proved to be a capable, if sometimes harsh, ruler. Wu's military strategy was primarily defensive, though the kingdom did launch occasional offensive operations. The natural barriers of the Yangtze River and the numerous waterways of the southeast made Wu difficult to invade. Any northern army attempting to conquer Wu would face the same challenges Cao Cao had encountered at Red Cliffs, fighting in an environment that favoured the defenders, dealing with disease in the hot, humid southern climate, and conducting naval operations against experienced marines. Wu also pursued expansion to the south and southwest, extending control into areas that are now part of Vietnam, Guangdong, and Guangxi. These campaigns brought new territories under Wu control and demonstrated the kingdom's ability to project power in regions where naval and riverine transport provided mobility. The subjugation of the Shanyu peoples in the mountainous interior of Wu's territory occupied significant military resources but helped secure the kingdom's borders and brought new populations under state control. The relationship between Wu and Shu Han remained generally cooperative, though strained at times, throughout most of the Three Kingdoms period. Both kingdoms recognized that their survival depended on preventing Wei from defeating either of them individually. An alliance of convenience persisted despite occasional tensions, territorial disputes, and the fact that Shu Han and Wu had very different political cultures and strategic interests. One significant breach in this alliance occurred in 219 to 122 AD, when Liu Bei launched a massive campaign against Wu to avenge the death of his sworn brother Guan Yu. Guan Yu had been captured and executed by Wu forces in 219 AD during a conflict over territory in Jing province. The incident revealed the tensions that existed even between the two southern kingdoms. Liu Bei's campaign ended in catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Xiaoting in 222 AD, where Wu forces under the command of Lu Xun used fire attacks, in a deliberate echo of the tactics at Red Cliffs, to destroy Liu Bei's army. This defeat significantly weakened Shu Han and nearly ended Liu Bei's kingdom before it had fully established itself. The Battle of Xiaoting demonstrated that Wu had learned the lessons of Red Cliffs well. Lu Xun, the Wu commander, initially avoided battle and retreated, drawing Liu Bei's forces deeper into Wu territory and extending their supply lines. When the Shu Han army established camps along a river valley during the summer heat, Lu Xun launched a coordinated fire attack on the camps. The flames spread rapidly through the Shu Han positions, and the army, trapped in the narrow valley, suffered devastating casualties. Liu Bei barely escaped and retreated to Baidi City, where he would die the following year in 223 AD. Possibly from illness, but also from the psychological and physical trauma of the defeat. The Three Kingdoms also engaged in sophisticated intelligence operations, propaganda campaigns, and attempts to foment internal dissent in rival states. Defectors and spies moved between the kingdoms, bringing military intelligence and political information. Each kingdom maintained extensive networks of informants in rival territories. Political refugees, defeated generals, and ambitious officials who felt overlooked in their home kingdoms might seek service with a rival state, bringing their knowledge and expertise with them. The economic dimensions of the Three Kingdoms period were as important as the military campaigns. Each kingdom had to develop taxation systems, maintain agricultural production, and manage resources to support military operations. Wei's control of the most productive agricultural regions gave it a substantial economic advantage. The North China Plains grain production could support larger armies and populations than the rice paddies of the south or the terraced fields of Sichuan. However, Wu's coastal position provided access to maritime trade and fishing resources that supplemented agricultural production. The kingdom developed a sophisticated shipbuilding industry that supported both military and commercial vessels. Wu ships traded with Southeast Asian kingdoms and may have travelled as far as India, bringing exotic goods and generating revenue through trade. Shu Han's economy was more constrained by its geography. Sichuan was productive, and could support a substantial population, but the difficulty of transporting goods over mountain passes limited trade and made it expensive to support military operations beyond the kingdom's borders. Salt production in Sichuan provided an important revenue source, as salt was a valuable commodity throughout ancient China. Shu Han also controlled some important iron-producing regions, which supported weapons manufacturing. The technological and military developments during the Three Kingdoms period had lasting influences on Chinese warfare. The period saw improvements in crossbow design, including repeating crossbows that could fire multiple bolts in quick succession. Siege warfare techniques advanced as kingdoms fortified their borders and key cities. The use of cavalry, particularly heavy cavalry armed with lances, increased during this period. Naval warfare continued to evolve based on the lessons of Red Cliffs and subsequent river battles. Ships became more specialized, with distinctions between transport vessels, combat ships designed for ramming or boarding actions, and lighter vessels for reconnaissance and pursuit. The use of fire weapons expanded beyond fire ships to include fire arrows, incendiary pots, and other means of using fire in combat. The Three Kingdoms also competed in the ideological realm. Each claimed to be the legitimate successor to the Han dynasty, with different arguments supporting their claims. Wei held the imperial regalia and controlled the traditional capital regions. Shu Han claimed blood descent from the Han imperial family through Liu Bei. Wu argued that it held the mandate of heaven through its virtue and effective governance. These competing legitimacy claims mattered because they shaped how each kingdom presented itself to the Chinese population and how they justified their existence and expansion. Religious and philosophical developments during this period also reflected the fragmented political situation. Buddhism, which had been introduced to China during the Han dynasty, continued to spread during the Three Kingdoms period. The religion appealed to populations suffering from warfare and instability, offering spiritual consolation and the possibility of salvation in an afterlife. Buddhist monasteries sometimes served as refugees from military conscription and taxation, creating tensions between Buddhist institutions and state authorities. Taoism also evolved during this period, developing more organized institutional structures and incorporating elements of folk religion and earlier philosophical Taoism. The Celestial Masters sect, which had played a role in the Yellow Turban Rebellion that contributed to the fall of the Han, continued to attract followers. Taoist practitioners claimed abilities to predict the future, perform healing, and communicate with spirits, services that had appeal in uncertain times. Confucianism remained the dominant ideology of the educated elite and the state bureaucracies. All three kingdoms relied on Confucian-trained administrators to manage their governments. The examination system for selecting officials, which had existed in various forms during the Han, continued to operate in the Three Kingdoms, though probably with regional variations. The study of Confucian classics remained central to elite education. The cultural production of the Three Kingdoms period included historical writing, poetry, and philosophical works that would influence Chinese literature for centuries. The poet Cao Ji, one of Cao Cao's sons, produced works that are still studied and admired. His Luo Shen Fu, Rhapsody on the Goddess of the Luo River, is considered one of the masterpieces of classical Chinese poetry. The period also saw the production of new commentaries on Confucian classics and the compilation of historical records that would become sources for later histories. The personal relationships and rivalries among the key figures of the Three Kingdoms added human drama to the political and military conflicts. The bond between Liu Bei and his sworn brothers Guan Yu and Zhang Fei became legendary, representing idealized loyalty and friendship. The relationship between Sun Quan and his generals, particularly Zhou Yu, Lu Su, and Lu Xun, showed the importance of trust between rulers and military commanders. The complex dynamic between Cao Cao and his sons, particularly the succession struggle that followed his death, illustrated the challenges of hereditary succession in military states. Women also played significant roles during the Three Kingdoms period, though their stories are less completely recorded in the historical sources. Empresses and concubines influenced policy and succession decisions. Sun Quan's sister, known as Lady Sun, was married to Liu Bei as part of the alliance between their kingdoms, a diplomatic marriage that created personal connections between the ruling families. The wives and mothers of key political figures sometimes wielded considerable informal power. The role of advisors and strategists extended beyond military matters to include diplomacy, espionage, and internal administration. The ideal of the loyal counselor who speaks truth to power even when that truth is unwelcome, was exemplified by various figures throughout the period. The tension between loyalty to a ruler and doing what was best for the kingdom created moral dilemmas that fascinated later commentators and storytellers. By the 250s AD, clear patterns had emerged in the relationships among the three kingdoms. Wei remained dominant but unable to conquer its rivals decisively. Shu Han was weakening, its offensive potential exhausted by the northern expeditions, and its internal politics increasingly dysfunctional. Wu remained secure behind its river barriers, but showed little capacity for expansion beyond its existing territories. The stalemate seemed likely to continue indefinitely. But underneath this apparent stability, forces were building that would transform the situation. Within Wei, the Sima family had gradually accumulated power. Sima Yi, who had defended against Zhuge Liang's northern expeditions, had died in 251 AD, but his sons Sima Shi and Sima Zhao continued to consolidate their family's control over the Wei military and government. The Cao family's actual power diminished, as the Simas maneuvered to control key institutions and military forces. In 249 AD, Sima Yi had launched a coup against the regent Cao Shuang, eliminating a rival power center within Wei. This coup demonstrated that real power in Wei lay with whoever controlled the military, not necessarily with the imperial family. Sima Yi's sons built on this foundation, crushing attempted resistance and systematically removing potential opponents. The Wei emperors became increasingly powerless, much as the last Han emperors had been under Cao Cao's control. The parallel was not lost on contemporary observers. The Sima family was doing to the Cao family exactly what the Cao family had done to the Han dynasty. This kind of political evolution, where powerful ministers gradually eclipsed their nominal masters and eventually usurped the throne, would become a recurring pattern in Chinese history. The Wei emperors could do little to stop it because the Simas controlled the armies and had cultivated loyalty among military commanders. In 263 AD, the Sima-controlled Wei launched a major invasion of Shu Han. The campaign, commanded by Zhong Hui and Deng Ai, exploited Shu Han's military weakness and political dysfunction. Deng Ai led a daring march through supposedly impassable mountain terrain, emerging in the Chengdu plain and threatening the Shu Han capital directly. The surprise appearance of Wei forces in the heart of Shu Han territory caused panic. The Shu Han Emperor Liu Shan, persuaded by corrupt advisors and believing resistance was futile, surrendered. The fall of Shu Han marked the beginning of the end of the Three Kingdoms period. For the first time since Red Cliffs, one kingdom had been completely eliminated. The conquest demonstrated that the strategic stalemate was not permanent and that the balance of power could shift decisively. The conquest also revealed that Shu Han's weakness was not primarily military but political. The kingdom collapsed because its leadership was dysfunctional and unable to mount effective resistance. In 265 AD, Sima Zhao's son Sima Yan forced the last Wei emperor to abdicate, just as Cao Pi had forced the last Han emperor to abdicate 45 years earlier. Sima Yan established the Jin dynasty, marking the formal end of Wei and the beginning of a new imperial line. The Jin immediately turned its attention to Eastern Wu, the last remaining independent kingdom. Eastern Wu in the 260s and 270s was a shadow of what it had been under Sun Quan. After Sun Quan's death in 252 AD, the kingdom had experienced succession struggles, court intrigue, and political instability. Later Wu rulers were less capable than Sun Quan, and the kingdom's military strength gradually eroded. Internal rebellions and palace coups weakened Wu's ability to defend itself. The unity and purpose that had characterized Wu under Sun Quan had dissipated. The Jin invasion of Wu began in 279 AD and concluded in 280 AD with Wu's surrender. The campaign demonstrated that even Wu's natural barriers could be overcome by a determined, well-organized offensive. Jin forces attacked from multiple directions, coordinating naval and land operations. Wu's defensive capabilities, weakened by decades of internal decay, proved insufficient. The last Wu emperor, Sun Hao, surrendered, and Wu was incorporated into the Jin Empire. With the fall of Wu in 280 AD, China was reunited under the Jin dynasty. The Three Kingdoms period had ended, 72 years after the Battle of Red Cliffs, and 60 years after the formal establishment of the Three Kingdoms. The reunification meant an end to the constant warfare that had characterized the period, though the Jin dynasty itself would prove unstable and would fracture within decades. The human cost of the Three Kingdoms period was enormous. Population estimates from the Han Dynasty suggest China had approximately 50-60 million people, around 157 AD. By the time of the Jin reunification in 280 AD, census records indicated only about 16 million people. While these numbers are likely imprecise due to incomplete census coverage, the dramatic decline reflects the devastation of warfare, disease, famine, and social disruption. Large areas that had been cultivated were abandoned. Cities were depopulated. The economic and social fabric of China had been severely damaged. The period's warfare had been particularly destructive because it was not simply a matter of armies fighting armies. Campaigns routinely involved the destruction of crops, the burning of villages, the forced relocation of populations, and massacres of civilians. Armies lived off the land, consuming or destroying local resources. Disease spread through military camps and then into civilian populations. Famine followed when agricultural production was disrupted by military operations or when farmers were conscripted into armies. The environmental impact was also significant. Deforestation occurred as armies needed timber for ships, siege engines, and fuel. Agricultural land fell out of production in contested border regions. Irrigation systems that required centralized maintenance deteriorated when political authority fractured. The recovery of China's population and economy after the Three Kingdoms period would take centuries. Yet despite, or perhaps because of this devastation, the Three Kingdoms period became one of the most celebrated eras in Chinese cultural memory. The period represented a time of heroes, when individual ability and character seemed to matter more than they did in more stable bureaucratic periods. The stories of loyalty, strategy, courage, and betrayal from the Three Kingdoms provided endless material for moral instruction and entertainment. The tension between historical fact and literary invention that we see with the Battle of Red Cliffs characterizes the entire Three Kingdoms period. The historical records, primarily the records of the Three Kingdoms compiled by Chen Shu in the 3rd century, provide a relatively sober account of events. But the romance of the Three Kingdoms transformed this history into epic literature, adding dramatic elements, inventing dialogue, creating fictional incidents, and transforming historical figures into archetypal heroes and villains. The romance's influence on Chinese culture cannot be overstated. For most Chinese people throughout the last 6 centuries, the romance has been their primary source of knowledge about the Three Kingdoms period. The novel's version of events has shaped popular understanding more than the historical records have. Characters are remembered as the romance portrayed them rather than as they appear in contemporary sources. Incidents that never happened are accepted as historical fact. Strategic principles that generals never articulated are attributed to them. This blending of history and legend has made the Three Kingdoms period uniquely resonant in Chinese culture. The period provides examples and analogies that people use to discuss contemporary politics and military affairs. Business leaders cite Three Kingdoms strategies. Politicians invoke Three Kingdoms precedents. The period's characters appear in proverbs and idioms that remain in common use. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Three Kingdoms period has been adapted to new media with remarkable success. Comic books, television series, films, and video games have introduced the period to new generations and to international audiences. The Dynasty Warriors video game series, which began in 1997, has sold millions of copies worldwide, introducing players who know nothing of Chinese history to characters like Zhuge Liang, Cao Cao, and Sun Quan. The 2010 Chinese television series Three Kingdoms ran for 95 episodes and attracted massive viewership. The Battle of Red Cliffs specifically has remained the most famous single event of the period. It appears in virtually every adaptation, usually with the fictional elements from the romance included. John Woo's 2008 film Red Cliff presented a visually spectacular version of the battle, using extensive CGI to recreate the fireship attack and the scale of the armies involved. The film was split into 2 parts in Asia, with a combined runtime of over 4 hours, but was edited into a shorter version for international release. It earned over $250 million at the global box office, becoming one of the most financially successful Asian historical epics. The enduring fascination with Red Cliffs relates to its dramatic power as a story. The image of fireships sailing into an enemy fleet, the courage required to implement such a plan, the ingenuity of using the enemy's own defensive measures against them, these elements create a narrative that works across different media and cultural contexts. The battle's outcome, preventing reunification, and creating the conditions for decades of three-way competition, gives it clear historical importance that justifies its prominence. But Red Cliffs also represent something more abstract, the possibility that intelligence and strategy can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. This theme resonates universally. Every culture has stories of clever underdogs defeating stronger opponents. Red Cliffs is China's version of this archetype, and the fact that it is grounded in actual historical events rather than pure mythology gives it additional power. The battle's lessons about naval warfare, the importance of environmental factors, the vulnerability of immobile targets, and the psychological impact of innovative tactics have been studied by military theorists. While the specific circumstances of Red Cliffs cannot be directly replicated, the principles it illustrates remain relevant. The battle appears in discussions of asymmetric warfare, where weaker forces must find creative solutions to defeat stronger opponents. Modern Chinese nationalism has also embraced the Three Kingdoms period, and Red Cliffs specifically. The period represents a time when China, despite being divided, remained culturally Chinese. The Three Kingdoms competed for supremacy, but shared cultural references, language, and historical consciousness. They all claimed to be the legitimate heir to the Han dynasty, implicitly accepting that there should be a unified Chinese empire. The eventual reunification under the Jin confirmed this shared assumption. For contemporary China, the Three Kingdoms period can be interpreted as demonstrating that even during times of division, Chinese civilization persisted and produced remarkable achievements. The period's eventual reunification can be read as evidence that Chinese unity is the natural state, and that division, however long it lasts, is temporary. These interpretations serve present political purposes, making the Three Kingdoms period relevant to contemporary discussions about Chinese identity and territorial integrity. The academic study of the Three Kingdoms period continues to produce new insights and interpretations. Archaeologists have excavated sites associated with key figures and events, providing physical evidence that complements or sometimes contradicts the historical texts. The discovery of Cao Cao's tomb in 2009, for instance, generated enormous public interest and scholarly debate about its authenticity and what it reveals about Cao Cao's life and death. Historical research has also worked to disentangle fact from fiction, identifying which events in the popular tradition actually occurred and which were later inventions. This scholarship has sometimes been controversial, as debunking beloved legends can be unpopular, but it has also deepened understanding of the period, revealing the real achievements and failures of historical figures who had been obscured by their legendary counterparts. The Three Kingdoms period's influence on military strategy extends beyond China. Japanese military theorists studied Three Kingdom strategies, and the period's battles appear in discussions of East Asian warfare. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms was translated into Japanese in the 18th century and became influential there, spawning Japanese adaptations and interpretations. Korean and Vietnamese military traditions also show knowledge of Three Kingdoms tactics and strategies. In contemporary strategic thinking, the Three Kingdoms period provides a case study in balance of power politics, alliance formation and dissolution, and the challenges of maintaining stability in a multipolar system. The period demonstrates how three competing powers can maintain an equilibrium where none is strong enough to defeat the others decisively, but each remains strong enough to deter aggression. This dynamic has parallels in modern international relations. The cultural legacy of Red Cliffs extends even to the landscape. The site traditionally identified as the battlefield, though its exact location remains debated, has become a tourist destination. A Red Cliffs Memorial Museum displays artifacts and provides historical context. The area has been developed to accommodate visitors who want to stand where the battle occurred, to see the river where the fireships burned, to imagine the armies that faced each other across the water. This kind of historical tourism raises questions about authenticity and commodification. How much of what visitors experience is genuinely historical, and how much is constructed to meet tourist expectations shaped by fictional accounts? The memorial sites often blend historical fact with legendary elements, presenting a version of events that satisfies popular understanding even when it contradicts scholarly consensus. Yet perhaps this blending is appropriate for an event like Red Cliffs, which exists simultaneously as historical fact and cultural myth. The battle that occurred in 208 AD was important, but the battle is remembered retold, and reimagined over nearly 2 millennia, has shaped Chinese culture in ways that transcend its historical importance. Red Cliffs is both a specific military engagement with analysable causes and consequences, and a symbolic event representing larger themes about strategy, courage, and the possibility of overcoming overwhelming odds. The fire that burned on the Yangtze in that winter of 208 AD illuminated more than just Cao Cao's fleet. It lit up possibilities, demonstrating that the seemingly inevitable could be prevented, that numerical superiority did not guarantee victory, that the course of history could be changed by human agency expressed through intelligence, planning, and courage. Those flames burned for hours, perhaps days, as the wooden ships were slowly consumed. But their light, metaphorically speaking, has never been extinguished. It continues to shine through the centuries whenever the story of Red Cliffs is told, reminding new generations that the powerful can be defeated, that unity can emerge from desperate alliances, and that sometimes the course of empire turns on a cold winter night when ships become weapons and the river itself becomes a battlefield.